Hello everybody, welcome to the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, just click on it, it only takes a second. Loads and loads of videos on doing stuff that people do, you know, that kind of thing, making things. So, today's job, we're going to start putting back together again the AFN diesel for the camper van over there. This video we're going to be rebuilding the rotating assembly. That should do it for this video. I think it'll get quite long otherwise, but yeah, that's what we're going to do. So we're going to have the crank back in, the rods in, the pistons in. We're going to be putting the shells in, gapping the piston rings, although they should be okay because they come pre-capped, but we'll check them, installing them, put the pistons in. So yeah, should be a good video. So the first step, before, well, the end of the last video, you'll see before I painted it and everything, I really cleaned this block. I went absolutely stupid on it, and that was probably 3 months ago now actually. But after I finished, I hosed everything down with WD-40 to stop any rust forming, and it's worked. There's nothing in here. And whilst it was on the engine stand, I actually slid a bin liner, a plastic carry bag over the top to stop any dust getting in, and that's worked too. It's not particularly dusty in here anyway. But as I say, the first thing basically is make sure everything's nice and clean, and it is. So we'll crack on. First job, we're going to install the crank. Now, when I took it apart, it's a 5 bearing crank, which means the crank has got 5 bearing journals all the way down it. It's then held in by the caps, which you'll see we put on in a minute. It does matter where they go, and it does matter which way round they go. You'll see in the last video when I took this engine apart, I actually marked, I used a centre dot on the crankcase here, and where the caps go and which way round they go, so I could put them. I can jumble those up right now, and I can still put them back in order the right way around. So they're sat over there. So I guess the first job, we're going to put the shells in this half. So let's get on with it. I've actually got some very good quality shells. They came all the way from Germany. They're called sputterized bearings. They do, go on YouTube, there's a video of it, I watched it. I think they charge them in nitrogen at some ungodly temperature and then cool them with argon. There's some process they do. Makes them last a lot longer. They're 3 times the price. But this is my engine, I want it right, so we're going to put these in. So, let's have a look. Everything's already clean, I did that before we started the video. As we look at the shell, we've got a little notch on it just there, and there's a corresponding little notch in the crankcase. Now that's to stop the crank taking the bearing around. If you've ever heard anybody spinning a bearing in a crank, it means the whole thing has spun around with the crank. It's usually because of an oil failure, and it's seized and brought it around. So, some people Loctite cranks in, I don't see the point. Loctite bearings in. But as we're going through, I'll show you now, there are 2 different sorts of bearings in this new set. There's the half that goes in the cap, and there's the half that goes in the crankcase, and they are different. So, oops, come in. Should really have had a table for doing this. This one is the one that goes in the crankcase. You can see it's got a hole in it and a groove. So the oil pressure is going to come in through here and then to the crank. So what we do, we're just going to put it in and rotate it in. And I'll bring the camera in when I've finished, but you can see now that's in nice and level, sat all the way down, and the hole in the block corresponds with the hole on the bearing. Now, if you were to put that in backwards, not that you can because you've got the little knob, but let's just say that you did, you'd actually cover the hole up for the oil in the crank, you cover the oil away, and the engine would just seize, so don't do that. So let's put the rest of them in. This is really simple, just be a bit delicate, don't ever force them. There's no need, if you're having to force it, something's wrong. So we'll just drop these in too. Don't bend them, don't crush them. You know, there's a bit of flex when they go in, but that just holds them in place. So that's 3, well that's 2. That's number 3. 4. That's nice, sat in. Number 5. Now on a lot of engines, once I've got number 5 in, although if it doesn't matter, some older engines are only a 3 bearing crank. But even if this was a V8, it'd still be a 5 bearing. The only time, it is basically a 4-cylinder crank. Even if it was a V8, you're still only 4 cylinders long. even though it's an 8-cylinder. If you're a 12-cylinder engine, you'd be 6 long, so you'd have more main end bearings. But most engines, this one is a little bit weird in that respect. That will be it now. We can put the crank in, and that would do us. But you have a thing called a thrust bearing, thrust washer. That's very often built into the middle journal. On these engines it's not, it's actually a separate bearing, so I'm going to put that in as well. That just slides in. Put those down there just for a second. And here they are, there's 2 of them. So what will happen is one either side of the crank. They'll sit in the side here, like that and like that, both sides. So when you put your foot on the clutch and the crank's pushed forwards, this is what's stopping it pulling the engine out of line. They're actually a little bit small, but I mean, these engines don't cause trouble for that kind of thing, so they must be okay. I'm actually going to show you this. They pop in there like that, and that holds it tight. But there's 2 little oil reliefs there, and I couldn't remember which way round they went. But as it happens, you can't actually put these in wrong. It won't fit, because it's got the locking peg in the top there. The bottom half will correspond to it. It all locks together nicely, and that'll do us. So just a little, it's in the manual as well. I actually managed to get a nice manual for this engine off the internet, which is giving me the torque values and stuff. So for right now, I'm going to put the thrust washers in. These are the ones that go in the bottom half. In we go. Okay, so they're in. That'll do us. But be careful with those. So the next step, I guess, is what we could do now is rest the crank in place, which to be honest I think I'm going to do that. But first, when you're building an engine like this, you can, well, any engine, you're going to have to rotate the engine at some point while you're building it, whether it be to put a piston in, whether it's to set the cam timing, whatever it is, you're going to need to turn the crank. So always lubricate the bearings, otherwise you're going to be moving dry on them, and that will mark them. Make no mistake. You can get special engine assembly lubricants, you can get all manner of things. I haven't got any, so I'm just going to use some straight 60 grade oil. I'm going to put it onto the shells with a paintbrush, and you know what, for this engine that is going to be good enough. If this was a race engine, I would have made the effort to go out and get the right stuff, but for what we're doing, it's going to be absolutely fine. I haven't got to turn this thing around 500 times before I finish. I'm not dialing cams in and things like that. So, bit of oil on there before we put the crank in, just to keep the bearings wet up. There we go. When you're doing that, make sure you don't get any oil down where the main end bolts go, because they're actually a blank hole. There's no exit to it. So if you were to fill that with oil and put the bolt in, you'll actually be squeezing the oil, and you will literally be able to torque the bolt against the oil pressure that you've got at the bottom of the hole. Now, the problem with that is the main bearing cap will be loose, so make sure they stay dry. You can lubricate the bolt, but use a little bit of grease. Okay, cranking. So, move those a second. The crank's clean. Make sure it's clean. You can run around with some emery cloth if you need to, but this crank was already done. So very, very gently, mind your fingers because it bloody hurts when you catch them. In it goes. Look at that, perfect fit. It's almost like it came out of this block. Beautiful. What I'm doing now, I'm just making sure it's settled, and it is. I've just lost a piece of my glove down there, I'll have to fish that out in a minute. So that's the crank installed. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on the top of the crank, why not? The crank was also stored in a nice clean bag, so there's no danger of any contaminants on that. In you go. Don't go mad again, it's just to protect it when you start turning it round. And there we go. Beautiful. And if you haven't got one, get yourself an engine stand. Magic thing. Right, that's all in. So what I'm going to do at this point, we're going to start and put the bearing caps back in. Now, this is journal number 3, it says so on it. and I stamped 3 into the block there, so I know number 3, the actual digit, goes towards that. That's just my method of doing it. You could even put a stamp on the bearing cap if you wanted to. It wouldn't matter, just as long as you know where that cap goes and which way around it goes. If I were to put that in backwards, there's a good chance I'm going to have trouble with the engine for doing that. We'll have a seizure of some description. So I'm going to start in the middle, just because it's good practice. And what I'm going to do, these are the other thrust washers, so these just slot into this one bearing cap. All the others are identical, but this one is different. So I'm going to put those in there like that and slide that in. Perfect. We're getting a couple of bolts. Now, some of the bolts in this engine you have to change, some you don't. These are a pretty much bog standard bolt. They've got a nice head on them, but they're a 10.9 tensile strength. They're a nice strong bolt, they're a hard bolt, they're not designed to stretch. That's the main thing. If it's a stretch bolt, you change it. These are not stretch bolts. So these can go back. I've lubricated these with a bit of grease before the video just to speed it up. So put them in, turn them down by hand. Yeah. There he goes. You don't want to be cross-threading anything. Be particularly careful if you're doing an aluminium block. You can really get yourself in a mess. Turn them in as far as you can by hand, and then I'm going to use a ratchet, but I'm going to be being very careful. I don't want to force anything. I want to make sure that this settles down nicely. Okay, they're all in. The eagle-eyed among you will have noticed I put the centre cap in with the thrust washers and forgot to put the main bearing shell in, but I'll put it back in now. So the next thing we've got to do is torque up these main end bolts. Okay, now I'm going to do this. They need to be pulled down to 65 Newton meters. They're only an M10, so that's about right. I'm not going to pull them straight down. I'm going to do it in stages. I'm only going to do 2 stages. I'm going to go 30 Newton meters, then I'm going to go up to 65. So get your torque wrench, pretty simple. Go up to 28. Come on. There we go. So that's 30. I'm going to start in the centre. I'm going to work my way around. Once we've got this first stage done, I'm actually going to just check the crank still spins again, just make sure nothing's pinching. So, first one, stop, stop. 10. Okay, so that's 30 Newton meters. When you're doing this, there are 5 bearing caps with 2 holes each, so there are 10 bolts. In my head then I was counting 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 10. Now if somebody's talking to you, whatever it is, turn the radio off, make sure you're concentrating. So count them as you're going through. I'll count the next time. If you know there are 10 and you've finished and you're at 9, well you've missed one, or you've missed count, whatever it is, check them again. That's how stupid mistakes happen, so just count. So that should turn nice and freely, and look at that, free as a bird, no problem at all. That's lovely. So let's go all the way up to 65 Newton meters. And that works out here, let's go, 56. 56. Turn that around to... That's 60. 65. Now with the small bolts, I'm actually using a much better torque wrench than this. With a bigger bolt, if you're a foot-pound or a Newton meter either way, it'll be fine. A lot of people say, oh, you can over-tighten the bolt and it'll pinch the crank. It won't, you'll just overstress the bolt. You will not make this casting get any closer to the other side of it. You can't do that. If you could put a stupidly high tensile bolt in there and put 300 Newton meters on it, the crank will still turn just as well as it does now. What you're doing is you're putting too much stress on the bolt and too much stress on the thread. That's why we're torquing them with a not a big bolt, but a relatively big bolt, a nice high tensile M10, if we're 1 Newton metre either way, it isn't going to come undone and it's not going to snap. So don't be too paranoid about it. The rod bolts, they're a much smaller bolt, they are a stretch bolt, so we need to make sure they're right. But let's do it again. I'll count this time. We'll start in the middle. 1 cap at a time. Don't do it like a cylinder head where you're jumping from one bolt to another. Do 1 cap at a time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So now I'm 100% sure I've torqued each one of those bolts up to 65 Newton meters, and I can forget about it because I know I've counted 10. I know I've done it. So first thing you do when you're finished, wind off your torque wrench. Don't ever leave your torque wrench with torque set on it. Puts them out of calibration. Okay, so once again, just to make sure we didn't have any contaminants in there, make sure there was, any number of reasons, a misshaped shell or whatever. So this now should turn exactly as it did before. The only reason it wouldn't is if I hadn't got the cap lined up correctly and it's pulled down a bit peculiar. That's why we're checking. So, one hand, we can still turn the crank. Beautiful, it's exactly as it should be. Right, next step then. So that's the crank in and done, everything's turning nicely, everything's torqued up. That's going to be changed. I can't put the back dress, I can't put the rear oil seal on yet because it's still on the engine cradle. Don't worry about it, we'll sort that out later. Next job, spin it up the other way around. We're going to look at the piston rings, check the gap on all the new ones. We're going to clean the piston ring grooves, fit them and put the pistons in.